Hello. Today I want to talk a little bit about the problem with spiritual teachings. I think ultimately it comes down to that no spiritual teaching is the truth. That in order to speak about it, we're putting it into words, which is automatically dualistic because words typically only have meaning because there's things that it's not. For example, chair only has meaning because there are things that are not chairs. If everything was a chair, then there'd be no real meaning to the word. Now, ultimately, the truth is non-duality. What we experience is non-duality. So as soon as we start trying to point or talk about it, we need to instill error. We have to deviate in order to talk about it. And when teachings are given, what is sometimes often forgotten is a good teacher will change their teachings based on where the seeker or student is at. I mean, it is one thing to teach from just your own standpoint. This is my experience. It is another to also go from my experience and my understanding of now the entirety. I can tell where you're at, and instead of trying, think about it as if you're mountain climbing. If you're in a certain location on the mountain, it's one thing to say, well, can you come over to here to where I came up, and then I can bring you up. It's another to be at the peak going, from where you're at, this is the best route. It's a different thing to teach strictly how you got up the peak versus the best path for you where you are now. And so there's a little bit of variation that can come into play because a teacher, a superior teacher in particular, will modify their teaching depending on what the audience, who they're talking to. And so if you listen to enough of their talks, they may actually contradict themselves. They may say one thing to one group and then say the exact opposite thing to another group. And this is what Zen would call skillful means, because to a certain extent what you're doing is you're tailoring to the group. Now, in the end, whatever is going on is the finger pointing at the moon, as Zen would say it. And too often, we focus on the finger and get attached to the finger. What is said, how it's said, the actual teachings, and we want to declare that the truth. It's just the finger. You have to look at what's being pointed at. And the moon, if you're in the northern hemisphere, if the moon is, if there's the earth and there's the moon, if you're in the northern hemisphere, you're kind of pointing that way to the moon. And if you're on the southern, you're pointing that way to the moon. The directions of the pointing, in absolute terms, vary. But they're pointing at the same thing. And it's kind of like, depending where you're at on the mountain, you could be pointing at the peak, but the peak might be north for one person, south for another, east for another, west for another. It depends where they are on the mountain. And so that's the fundamental problem with spiritual teachings, is we become attached to the teachings. We can't just simply see past the teachings sometimes to see what's really being pointed at. And so I recommend to take a little bit more fast and loose approach with spiritual teachings in terms of don't get so caught up on what is being said. Don't become overly attached to something. I was in a conversation earlier this week where somebody was saying, they were referring to Ramana Maharshi, and they said, well, Ramana Maharshi said, we aren't the doer, that the divine is the doer. That was the teaching for whoever he was speaking to at the time. However, this person became very attached to it and wanted to make divine agency the sole agency. And him personally, not the doer. And I said, well, the fallacy, of course, is there's only the self. There is no duality. And so, in saying the divinity is the sole doer and I am not the doer, you're creating separation. You're creating a duality that doesn't exist. And so, depending on who is being spoken to, this is a good teaching, a good pointer. However, if you take it as absolute truth and try to say that this is how it is, you'll get stuck because there was an error put in there in order to talk about it. And depending on the direction it's being pointed at, may not be true for you where you are. And so, don't become attached to any teachings. Take what's useful and let the rest go. Thank you.